Welcome to Community Crypto on CoinDesk TV. I'm your host, Isaiah Jackson, and this week we are discussing the impact of media in the Bitcoin and cryptocurrency space. I'm joined now by Nathaniel Whittemore, aka NLW, the host of the popular podcast, The Breakdown, which is produced and distributed by CoinDesk. Welcome to the show, NLW.
Hey, man, it's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you, man. And, everybody we bring on the show, we always want to find out, what was your genesis story into the Bitcoin and crypto space? And were you doing media before the podcast?
Man, that's interesting. I've always done content creation in some form or another. It's a way of figuring out what I think about things. And frankly, I think, I was exposed first to Bitcoin back in like 2012 in San Francisco. I was in the tech scene, but back then it was really just about payments, and it wasn't sort of this disruptive thing for many people there. It was just a competitor to Square, which is ironic now. But it wasn't actually until I left San Francisco and started to think about it from a different lens, through more of a social impact lens, through more of a global lens, which is kind of where my professional roots were. I spent my first few years after college helping kids go all over the world to learn about how to be effective making change. And it was only when I put Bitcoin in that context that it hit for me. And that was around 2017. And that got me hooked and kind of, for me, I've always had content and media as a way to help explore and, basically learn in public.
Mm-hmm. And definitely, speaking of that content, on your show, The Breakdown, recently you covered Gary Gensler, the SEC chairman, and his speech about the crypto industry. Let's take a listen.
The biggest dividing line among politicians who have questions about crypto is whether those questions are about things like investor protections, but they remain enthusiastic about possibilities, or whether those politicians only see systemic risk and an enemy that must be fought. I, at this point, am willing to engage with just about anyone who falls into that first category, because the second category is where the real existential battles lie. Welcome back to The Breakdown with me, NLW.
Oh, yeah. So first, amazing intro there. But first of all, what did you get out of Gensler's speech, and what was your reaction to it?
So I think, it was interesting. I think a lot of folks in this space were so convinced that he was going to be a pro crypto actor that when he sounded at all like he had an agenda that was about regulating crypto, they had a sort of an initial negative reaction, which I think is understandable. But, to me, that quote really summed it up. There are two really different conversations around why crypto needs to be regulated. One is it's an important part of the future, and we have to adapt our systems to be a part of that, but also it has to adapt to fit into what we're doing. And the second is this is a scary thing that threatens the systems that we've built, and we really need to see if it even is worth it, right? And Gensler is very much in that first camp, talking about investor protections. That's it. That is literally his mandate and his job as SEC chair, right? So I don't think it's surprising to see him talking about investor protections. And at no point did he say, my colleagues who are increasingly wondering if there's systemic risk in the opacity of holdings of, crypto by hedge funds means that we shouldn't allow this thing. There's none of that there. So I still think that he's really in that first camp of, this is an important future thing, but we also can't sort of forget about how it's going to fit into all these sort of public policy frameworks that we've built so far.
Yes, and I believe Gensler is taking a more nuanced approach, which is a little bit better than the infrastructure bill, which is actually being voted on today. How do you feel about the infrastructure bill where they slid in crypto provisions where basically everybody and their mother is a broker now? Anybody who has any adaptation with Bitcoin. How do you feel about that infrastructure bill? And are regulators at this point sort of all over the place?
Well, I think that these represent two poles of two types of regulator politician right now that wants the ability to have crypto fit into their framework. On the one end of the spectrum, you have Gensler, who says, look, I'm the SEC. My mandate is investor protections. There's things that hurt investors. I want to make sure we have the tools to fix them. Now, there's tons of critiques that are good of Gensler, and you don't really have to look any farther than Hester Peirce and other sort of commissioners on the SEC to see some of those critiques. why won't the SEC just come up with a framework for what is and isn't a security versus just showing us that through enforcement? They just had another enforcement action this week where they failed to say which securities were the reasons that Poloniex was being fined. So, but still, that's the kind of the good side. The infrastructure bill was an absolute sucker punch from behind, trying to sneak something in by the Treasury Department. I mean, what's been revealed is that this went all the way up to Treasury Secretary Yellen, who wanted the Treasury Department to have as much authority as possible to write things however they wanted. And now I think that the generous sort of non-cynical take isn't that she is convinced that this has to be regulated out of existence or anything like that. She hasn't really given that indication. It's more that they want unfettered power to determine that without any sort of barriers in between. And so that's why it was so weird that they kept fighting back against just clarifying who they meant, because Rob Portman, the author of the bill, saying, well, that's not who we meant. That's not who we meant. Turns out what he really was saying is, what the Treasury Department wants is maximum authority to write this as they want. So I'm going to try to get this through with the maximum flexibility, and I'll just leave this kind of floor speech saying who I didn't intend, but ultimately it's going to be someone else that interprets the law. So I thought it was extremely frustrating that the support or the defense of this whole thing was we should be giving the Treasury Department maximum flexibility to design legislation for something they clearly don't understand. And by the way, we don't have any, show me the receipts. Where's that? What adds up to 28 billion? I want to know how many people, if there's a paid course of someone who's that many people who are that good at evading taxes, you know what I mean? It's a joke, obviously, but come on, 28 billion of unpaid taxes, that's extraordinary. I would like to see how that compares to what they say was actually reported. Are you saying that 90% of the people and 90% of the transactions in this industry aren't there? So it was like I said, the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of frustration and threat, I think, to the industry.
Yes, and like you just said, it was something that was a sucker punch. They slid it in. They tried to bring it out on a Saturday afternoon when nobody is paying attention, and of course, the wording that was in there, people spoke out about it, on social media. And of course, that's pretty much the only source people had to see the pushback, or people may have not heard about it. The 28 billion is crazy because, especially when they just printed all this money. So again, like you said, a lot of people may not have that information, but that leads me to my next question. What role do you think the media and podcast shows in the Bitcoin space play in getting this information out to the people?
Well, the interesting thing is that I said this on some show at some point over the last week. I wonder if anyone either over in Treasury or anyone who supported this, the provision in the first place, was just sitting there being like, I can't believe that we have waded into this landmine of people. And I think in some ways, it's like the thing that mattered about Bitcoin media wasn't so much just what was happening at the time that this sort of crisis came up. It's that the infrastructure was there, right? This is a group that's incredibly highly enfranchised. They get their, news from probably at least 4 or 5 different sources. They have probably a ranked tier of people whose opinions they trust on Twitter. They have some people who they think their opinions are good about some things and not good about other things. You know what I mean? This is such a highly enfranchised audience that when they came for us, it was kind of destined for them to have such a huge response because people were ready to listen. They already had their sources. They didn't have to go figure out that they should be listening to your show or my show. It was there waiting for them because they're already that type of person who's that engaged, And I think that was a big part of how strong the counterpunch, to keep using this metaphor, was.
Yeah, and I think people are unable to understand that unless they enter into this Bitcoin space, because when you see the podcast, when you see the people that people look to for information, you're right. A lot of the smartest people in the world are in this space. So you're not going to get pushback that's just, sort of flimsy. It's definitely going to be, founded in research. So I'm glad that you stated that there. And because Bitcoin media is that way, do you think, on the other hand, that mainstream media does a good job of covering Bitcoin?
I mean, stop trying to set me up. No, of course not. This is a terrible job. But I will say, though. I try to use my polite language. No, it does a historically terrible job. But here's the one. I'll be optimistic. Actually, it was so clear. The response, the story, the narrative was so clear that it was pretty unignorable. I mean, for the first probably 48 hours, I feel like there was really a push to make this be just like, oh, look, the crypto industry just doesn't want to pay taxes. They want to, kind of support their tax evasion. And that just didn't stick. It wasn't a sticky narrative because it was so transparently unclear, right? When you have the CEOs of every exchange in the world being like, we've been literally begging you for better tools to help people report their crypto transactions, which, by the way, is not something they've supported. I've worked with companies in the past who've tried to help exchanges with their 1099 reporting. It's very complicated because of the nature of UTXOs and all these technical things, right? Like, it's not as easy as it sounds, and they hadn't been helpful with that, but it didn't stick is the point. And the narrative started to shift to, holy crap, these guys are kind of organized, and man, this lobby's actually kind of winning concessions. And like, all of a sudden, every senator is like, I got to figure out about this thing. So you did see the media shift. And I think to the credit of at least some amount of like neutrality, like if you watched like Jeffree Stein, the lead reporter on this from the Washington Post, the dude was very clearly trying to learn as he was going. He was like, okay, I got to actually learn more about this, pay attention. He's a political reporter. And I thought that was positive to see that like whatever biases some of those folks had maybe coming in, they weren't trying to stick with them. They were trying to get the real story because it was clear that the real story wasn't just a bunch of internet degens not wanting to pay their taxes.
Yeah, and we have the data to support that. That's another thing. We have, 0.3% of transactions are for illicit activities. And like you said, nobody was trying to evade taxes. They're literally asking for the tools. But I think our regulators, they move too slow in order to keep up with this market. As you can see with the Poloniex news, as we just said, getting fined by the SEC for $10 million. People stopped using Poloniex maybe like 3 or 4 years ago. Nobody was really using that. So as you can see, it takes a little time. So I'm with you there that these regulators definitely need to get with the times, need to figure out how to approach these different rules. And with that being said, what are your feelings about the current market? Do you think these regulators can somewhat suppress it? Or do you think what they're doing is sort of like prohibition? They're just making the market more valuable the more they talk about it.
It feels to me like we will look back at this week as a pretty seismic shift. I think that if powers that be in the US, in the Biden administration or in Congress or the Senate really wanted to actually effectively ban this industry, they have perhaps lost that chance forever. I mean, we can debate like how hard they could have made it even in the past, but like, by coming so hard in such a way that revealed the bankruptcy of this part of the political process, they actually not only put more of a spotlight on us, they gave us more allies. Like, we would not have had this number of allies, like, and bipartisan too. Like, they lost their chance to make it a partisan issue as well. It's going to be way harder forever, because it was Ron Wyden digging in, the Democratic, head of the Senate Finance Committee as a supporter of this. So I actually think that to the extent that the goal for anyone was to shadow ban or effectively head us towards a kind of elimination of this technology, that hand was seriously misplayed. I think that the reality of and the inevitability of this industry is higher now than it has ever been because of what happened over the last week, despite the provision remaining with that original language.
Yes, and I've witnessed it myself with the community. We're on heightened alert now, and of course, with that being said, tell us a little bit more about your podcast, The Breakdown, and could you explain to us how you've been able to build that community, which, of course, as we know, a very smart group of people, and what are some of the plans for the show in the future?
So, I mean, I always say to folks, like, for me, it's really about power. Like, what I'm interested in is shifts in power and how they happen. And, I'm particularly interested in financial shifts in power because I think that that's obviously such a huge source of power in the world. I think it's also a tool of power that has been historically used to exclude. So I'm interested in shifts in power. I'm interested in financial shifts in power. In that framework, you can't really not talk about Bitcoin. And that's why the show is so focused on Bitcoin. And, I'm always looking out for where other parts of this crypto industry are also sort of interacting with power, right? Like I've done shows about NFTs, not sort of from the like market hype standpoint, although I'll mention that here and there, but more from the standpoint of like, could this break the power of the music industry? Does it change the business model of being a musician, right? That's the type of stuff that gets me really excited. In terms of plans for the future, man, there's no shortage and going to be no shortage, I think, of big picture power shifts. So, I can't imagine that that's going to change. But I think, a lot of the things that I'm looking forward to in the future are better tools for the community. So, better web resources, there's been I've been on the edge of creating Discord, a Discord forever and dabbled with it at the beginning of COVID-19 lockdowns, but it's just so much. So I'm basically going to try to bring in more resources to give people more tools and have these conversations. Because to your point, and I know you see it with your community too, like this is, I think, probably more than any other industry in the world, a place where like almost every listener to these shows has a voice that could be a participant and deserves to be a participant. So if I can find ways to give more of that platform, I think that would be a win.
Oh yeah, and it sounds good to me. And I can't wait to see what you have planned in the future because again, like I said, amazing podcast, so much great information there. And with the shift in power, it is the fourth turning right now. So that shift in power will definitely be coming in the future. Thank you for coming on the show, NLW. I appreciate you, man.
Always great to chat. I'll catch you soon.
Yes, sir. Coming up next, we continue the discussion about Bitcoin in the media with a very popular podcaster. Stay tuned. Welcome back. On this episode of Community Crypto, we're talking to podcasters who play a major role in the crypto space. Our next guest is the host of the popular podcast, What Bitcoin Did.
Regulators are not going to be happy that there are unregulatable systems out there. Bitcoin has shown that if you get to a degree of decentralization, you cannot be stopped.
Hello there from Bedford in the United Kingdom. How are you all doing? All eyes on the infrastructure bill over the weekend. I assume most of you have been watching what is going on.
That was Eric Voorhees of Shapeshift, speaking with the one and only Peter McCormack. Welcome, Peter.
Hello, mate. How are you? I haven't spoken to you in ages. Are you all right?
Doing great, man. I was just saying the same thing. It's been too long, man. Glad to have you on.
Too long. Wow, man. Listen, we've got to get you back on the show. So much to talk about.
Absolutely. And that's why I brought you on here so we can talk on here as well. And, we just played the clip of you talking with Eric Voorhees, speaking about Shapeshift going decentralized in lieu of the recent regulation. And what do you think about the recent infrastructure bill? What are your feelings on it as far as them sliding crypto in there and how they will regulate it?
Well, it's a really tricky thing. I'm British, so we have a very different system. We have a very different government, very different structure in the UK. It highlights some of the things I really dislike about the US government, but some things I really like about it. I think what it is for me is that it highlights a really important thing is this almost like acceptance that crypto is here to stay. I mean, I'm a Bitcoiner, so I really care about that. But there's kind of an acceptance it's here to stay by some people, the fact they want to regulate it and tax it. But also there is that kind of fear that it's a step-by-step death by a thousand cuts, or they keep chipping away and keep making Bitcoin more and more difficult to use. So I kind of have split views on it. But ultimately, the best thing about it is just seeing how various people who represent Bitcoin companies or Bitcoin holders came together and decided, we're not going to accept this. We're going to show that the Bitcoiners are a force to be reckoned with. And I think it'll be really interesting to the next round of votes, because I think there'll be a certain amount of pressure put on politicians who are against this. I also think that idea that someone who's like 125 years old can vote against things that affect the future of people who are in their 20s is kind of bullshit as well.
Oh, yeah. And I would tend to agree with you there simply because we haven't seen anything innovative from some of the older regulators. They just sit there, they wait for new stuff, and then figure out how to control it, which doesn't help at all. So as a fellow Bitcoin, I'm with you there. And I want to get into that a little bit. As a Bitcoiner, I saw you posed a question on Twitter or a statement saying, do you feel pressure to not talk about other cryptos? And I wanted to ask, do you feel pressure to only speak about Bitcoin and not discuss anything else in the market?
Actually, I think that tweet was a wider point. It's about holding certain views and opinions. So I know we share a language with America, but we're actually quite different, Europeans and Americans. We have different governance structures, and we have just different laws. We don't have guns in the UK. It's quite rare. I don't really want to see them there. But that goes up against the idea of the Second Amendment, which a lot of Americans really stand for and like the idea that they can defend themselves. We don't have free speech, which I do wish we have, which you do have in the US because you have the First Amendment protection. There's a lot of differences between the UK and the US. And sometimes I feel like a lot of the Bitcoin narrative is led with Americans type views. And they're quite different from British views. We tend to be a little bit more collectivist, and the US tends to be a little bit more individualist. And so many times I've got things that I'm thinking and ideas I want to share or thoughts I want to put out there. And sometimes I'm like, if I put this out there, there's going to cause another storm. Be it my views on, I don't know, COVID, or be it my views on that I'm not an anarchist. So sometimes I feel like there's a certain amount of pressure to avoid toe the line, because you toe the line, you can get potentially cancelled or get a lot of bullshit. We saw what happened with Breedlove recently. Somebody actually said to me, said, you need to be careful, you're going to get Breedloved. And it's kind of like quite a coercive statement to say to somebody, like, we put Breedlove's head on a spike and we warned you all, and if you don't toe the line, you're going to be next. And that, to me, for people who talk about free speech and liberty, is quite a coercive threat. Also, I'm quite open about my views on COVID. It's a very challenging subject. A lot of Bitcoiners talk about it. So I added my voice, which is, look, it's a complicated subject. If you catch COVID, there is a non-zero risk that you might get seriously ill or die or have long-term. Because if you take a vaccine, there's a non-zero risk. There is a trade-off to be made, but I've made my views public that it should be your own choice. It shouldn't be mandated. I've taken the vaccine. I think it's net benefit. I mean, in the last couple of days, I've had somebody email me and tell me they hope I die, they hope my whole family dies. I've had other things where people are like making threats to me. They're quite coercive pressures. I've also had someone turn up at my house once, even though he turned out to be a nice person. It's quite a reality check when someone turns up at your house. So there are certain pressures that come with being a voice or listening to you. In the end, I'm still going to kind of try and say what I want to say, but sometimes you have to pick your words very carefully, which is especially difficult when you've only got 280 characters.
Yeah. And do you think podcasters and people like me and you who have shows, do we have a responsibility to speak about certain things with nuance, or do we not owe anybody anything? We can just give our opinion. Because as you said, I mean, when you're a rock star podcaster, all of a sudden these new pressures show up. So do you think we have a mandate to speak a certain way?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a funny thing because I didn't plan any of this, right? And I think some people are media trained or media ready. They have a life already in the public eye, and when they start maybe a podcast, they're used to dealing with certain things. And then there's someone like myself or yourself, and we start a podcast as a hobby, and a few years pass, and suddenly you've got millions of listeners and hundreds of thousands of followers, and matters, which is a really weird place to be in, especially if you've not been trained for it. You're learning in public, and it can get really tough sometimes. There is a pressure. I think ultimately, if you stand for liberty and freedom and free speech, then you don't have a responsibility to anyone. You just have a responsibility to yourself. I, at the same time, do think there's a responsibility. And I think ultimately, one of the biggest responsibilities we have is challenging assumptions, challenging the norm. If there is a set narrative which is being followed by a group of people, I think it's important to challenge that. Somebody said to me early on, if you're not pissing people off, you're not doing your job properly. You're not a journalist. You're a cheerleader. And I feel like a leader, and sometimes I feel like a journalist. It's an area of being a podcaster. But ultimately, I think it's important to listen to all voices. Maybe selectively remove a few nutters, but listen to as many voices as possible, and just try and share as many opinions as possible, because not everyone's an anarchist, not everyone's right wing, not everyone's libertarian, not everyone's left wing. There's 8 billion people in the world. We've got to find a way to figure out how we're going to live and work together. And if you only listen to one point of view and you tell everyone else to shut the fuck up, you don't really make any progress.
Yeah, I definitely don't want to get breedloved, but it's funny that that's even an adjective, because as much as he's done for the space, him exploring another project has people up in arms. And like you said, you have to be able to say what you want, but it comes at a cost, right? It's about, basically your your cost basis. If you want to take that risk, cool. People may love you, but if not, as you know, some people may have a problem with it.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think the project he checked out was as a show, but at the same time, the concept idea that you challenge and create a new social network with different game theory is kind of interesting. I think if it was a Bitcoin-based project, people would have loved it, and it wasn't. And you know what? It was a shitcoin, and their launch was a bit of an abomination. But at the same time, to go out there and try and cancel somebody because of it, because you figure out their incentives, I think it was overkill. I think it was right for maybe people to criticize they disagree with it, but effectively it felt like a lynch, and that they was like, here's a head on a spike. If you shitcoin, we're gonna be done with you. And I don't support that at all. I love Breedlove. He's a great human being. I've spent time with him, hung out with him. He's a brilliant family man, and he cares deeply about other people and Bitcoin. I think it was overkill, and I think it was a mob mentality led by a few people. And you can see the difference between those who wanted to give constructive criticism and those who just wanted to ruin his life. I think the constructive criticism is fair, and he would have taken it on the chin. And I think those are people who want to ruin his life, honestly, need to get the fuck out of it.
Yeah, I hear that. And I wanted to switch a little bit to some of the things you've done recently. You visited El Salvador, am I correct? Not too long ago?
Yeah, I mean, I've been 4 times now, and I'm going again in a few weeks. Yeah, I'm going again in a few weeks. Love it there, dude.
Oh, yeah. Tell us a little bit more about Bitcoin Beach, El Salvador, how it's going, and also, too, maybe a little bit about the projects they have planned.
Yeah, I mean, Bitcoin Beach is a project that was started by Michael Peterson a year and a half to 2 years ago. I met him in Uruguay in 2019, I think it was. So I went out and visited the project, and it was just this basic little project where he had a Bitcoin donation, and he was recruiting kids to work in the local community and pay the coin to help them avoid joining gangs. And he set up some local businesses to accept Bitcoin. This little circular economy, and fast forward at 18 months, and that has expanded to now the government making Bitcoin legal tender, which would probably never have happened if Mike hadn't started that project. So it's super fascinating, and all eyes on El Salvador. September the 11th, the law comes into force, and Bitcoin will be legal tender, and all economic agents will be having to accept Bitcoin. Now, there's a lot to see in terms of the government wallet and how this rolls out. I think they're going to have some very sharp eyes on them, and like any false move with a serious amount of criticism. But at the same time, it's a super interesting project for Bitcoin. So, I welcome the project. I'm interested to see how it rolls out, and if I can support the people in any way, I will. At the same time, as a government, so we should always not trust and verify and see what their intentions are. But it's a super interesting Bitcoin. I mean, is there anything wilder happening right now than the government making it legal tender?
And I really think they're the testing grounds, and then you'll see a flood of other smaller countries do the same thing if it's rolled out, fairly decent. They have said the airdrop is coming. If the wallets are useful, or if they're being used by everybody, I think we'll have a lot of countries that adopt it. So. Glad to see you've been back and forth to El Salvador and doing that. But I want to get a little bit into your podcast as well, What Bitcoin Did, which is very popular, and just some of the guests that you've had. Who were some of the guests that you had that were most inspirational, or some of your favorite ones as far as the topic of Bitcoin?
Well, it's very hard now not to just talk about the interview with President Bukele, because somebody starts a podcast as a joke or a hobby 4 years ago, and it doesn't really think about where it's going to go. And at a time when my life was complete shit show. I mean, I'd got divorced and recovering drug addict, and I was dealing with a financial collapse. To start a podcast as a joke, and then 4 years later, being financially in a good position and interviewing the president, it's a really weird journey. It's a really weird chain of events that gets you there. So that's really hard on a personal level, not to just look and say, wow, what a sense of achievement. Like, to be in a position where I'm at the presidential palace interviewing President Bukele and doing the first interview on Bitcoin. I was really proud of that. But there's been so many interviews. Like I think my 10th interview was with Lynn Ulbricht, Ross Ulbricht's mother. Mm-hmm. So I'd done 9 interviews before that, but But when I did that one, I was kind of like, oh, this is important, actually, what I'm doing here. These are important stories that are around people's lives. And that was the one where I was like, I need to take this a little bit more seriously. Dude, interviewing you. I loved interviewing you. I love the work you're doing, man. It was great to connect with you. You know what it's like, man. You've done a podcast. It's hard to it's like picking favorite children. You can't really do it.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, I had to let the people out there. That was my slick way of sliding in there to go watch my podcast on there. but yeah, I mean, you're right. It's so many awesome people. Absolutely. So many awesome people to interview. So it's like, how can you choose? But yeah, I know, as you know, the podcast world, as far as interviewing, you've moved up very quickly. And I want to ask you by the year 2040, and we'll end off here. Where do you think the Bitcoin media game will be as far as how influential it'll be, and what will you be doing by 2040 with the podcast?
2040, wow. I mean, 19 years time. How old will I be? I'll be 60. I'll be 61 years old. I mean, firstly, I hope I'm alive. I hope the world hasn't been decimated by climate change or world war or other general weirdness. Where will Bitcoin media be? Well, I don't know, man. I mean, if Bitcoin continues to take the journey it's taking, Bitcoin will be implanted within the public consciousness, and I would imagine we'll have hundreds of millions, if not billions, of people owning and using Bitcoins. So I guess it will be bled. Either it will be bled into the mainstream media, or mainstream media itself will have died, and the independents will have taken over. God, that's a tough question to know. Honestly, I don't know. I hope I'm alive. I hope I'm well. I hope my children are well. And what I'll be doing, I'd like to think by then I'm just relaxing, man. Maybe sit on a beach, drinking a cocktail, hanging out with you, not giving too much of a shit. Not on Twitter. Not getting invites.
Maybe doing a like Johnny Carson type Bitcoin late night show. It'll be
dude, yeah. Just a couple of nights a week. Someone else doing all the other work, and I'm just relaxing.
Exactly. Yeah, just show up, and talk, and then go back to the beach. I'm with you.
That'd be it, man. That'd be the dream.
I love it. Oh yeah, appreciate you for coming on, Peter. Glad to have this discussion with one of the top podcasters, the What Bitcoin Did podcast host, Peter McCormack. Thank you for coming on, man.
See you later, brother. Bye.
That's it for this episode of Community Crypto. I'm your host, Isaiah Jackson, and every week we're building a global community with local crypto groups. So be sure to tune in at 4 p.m. Eastern on CoinDesk TV. See you then.